I grew up in the 70s and 80s, primarily reading Marvel comics. And as I got older, I started reading DC comics. And I think DC comics are written for a slightly more mature audience. Um, One of the reasons why I think so many people are going to comics now as source material is that I've always felt that comic books kind of represent this generation's, Greek heroes. I mean, where do these mythic figures come from? I learned about things like morality and heroism from Spider-Man, from Captain America. I didn't learn it, unfortunately, necessarily from reading a lot of the classics in school. They were from comic books, and after school, we would play on the playground and we'd talk about, well, which superhero do you want to be, and why and how and whose powers, and these characters all. A lot of them, they were all heroic in their own way. They stood for justice, and I think that is where a lot of the modern day archetypes come from now, from these archetypal characters. I mean, Batman and Superman have completely permeated the public consciousness, and I just think that that's the source material for a lot of these heroic figures now. Unfortunately or fortunately, depending on the way you look at it, kids tend to gravitate towards those, sources first.
Years ago, there was a great comic book company called EC Comics, and they're the ones who started Mad Magazine, but before that they were doing the Vault of Horror and the Crypt of Terror and books like that. They were really wonderful, but some people objected. They felt they were a little too violent. So the comic book publishers got together and formed an organization called I think it was called the Comic Book Publishers Association of America, and it was a self-censorship body where they formed some rules of conduct. They're not allowed to have any rape, or they're not allowed to show blood or discuss drugs, things like that. And all the publishers agreed to that. And somehow or other, it served to make the books a lot tamer, and eventually EC Comics suspended all their publication, and the only thing they had was Mad Magazine after a while.
Here are some of the things that if you were trying to create a comic book in 1954 that you would not be allowed to do according to the comic book code. In every instance, good shall triumph over evil, and the criminal punished for his misdeeds. Passion or romantic interest shall never be treated in such a way as to stimulate the lower and baser emotions. Females shall be drawn realistically without undue emphasis on any physical quality. If crime is depicted, it shall be as a sordid and unpleasant activity. Suggestive and salacious illustration or suggestive posture is unacceptable. All lurid and unsavory or gruesome illustrations shall be eliminated. This is a good one. The letters of the word crime shall never be appreciably greater in dimension than the other words contained in the title. The word crime shall never appear alone on a cover. No comic magazine shall use the word horror or terror in its titles. And here's the best one. Scenes dealing with or instruments associated with Walking Dead, torture, vampires and vampirism, ghouls, cannibalism, and werewolfism are prohibited. So as you could see from this, that really eliminated quite a few themes from creating comic books back in the 50s. And even today, a lot of these themes are still not even touched upon.
There was only one time that we had a big problem with the code. I had received a letter from the Office of Health, Education, and Welfare in Washington. This was years ago, and right after Spider-Man became popular, it must have been in the late 60s, maybe the early 70s, I have no memory for dates, but the letter said that recognizing the popularity of Spider-Man with young people, we think it would be great if you would do an anti-drug story in your comics that your young readers could read, and it would do a lot of good. Well, we know better than to just obviously preach to young people, because that's not the way to reach them. But I found a way to do a 3-part Spider-Man story, and within the confines of that plot, we had one of Spider-Man's friends who had taken an overdose of something and he was standing on a rooftop and he thought he could fly, and it was up to Spider-Man to save him before he jumped. And Spider-Man did and gave him a lecture on what an idiot he was to take whatever drug. I know nothing about drugs. I didn't even know what to call the drug. I just said he took something and he overdosed. But at any rate, the story worked very well. But what happened was, when we submitted the book to the comic book code office, they rejected it, these 3 books. And I said, what are you rejecting it for? And they said, according to the code, you're not allowed to mention drugs. And I said, but we're not telling kids to take drugs. It's an anti-drug element in a story. He said, that doesn't matter. According to the code, you cannot mention drugs. Well, I felt that was just so stupid and sophomoric on their part that we took the code symbol off the covers of our books, and we published the books anyway.
I remember reading Tomb of Dracula, which was the Marvel comic that Blade first appeared in. I think he showed up in 72 or 73, and I would have been 7 years old. And I remember going down to the local drugstore and grabbing one of the Tomb of Dracula comics off the spinner, and I just thought Blade was the coolest character I'd ever seen. And I love the fact that he was so much darker and more brutal than Captain America. He just seemed completely different, to inhabit a different kind of world. And I'd always had a fondness for the character, and because of that, I just thought it would translate well to film. He doesn't have a bunch of costumes, and he's got gadgets, but they're all, I mean, it sounds odd to say, but Blade was a much more realistic character, and it's in his own way.
Of course, over the years, comic books have gotten darker anyway, and a lot of them today aren't that dissimilar to the old Tales from the Crypt. We still, over at Marvel anyway, we still try we try to differentiate between exciting and violent. We try not to make our books violent, but we try to get a lot of excitement and a lot of danger and suspense and things like that. And of course, in our vampire stories like Blade, you get all of that you could ever want.
You know, a successful comic book still has to be well written. People will ultimately turn off to it if it's just eye candy. Even today, even 14-year-olds, it has to be well written. I mean, some of the classic, writers like Alan Moore, I mean, who created Watchmen, he's just an incredible writer. I mean, I think he's a great writer in any genre. He's just a great writer, period, who happens to work in the medium of comic books. Grant Morrison is another writer who's writing the Justice League right now. He's an incredible writer. He's very clever. Frank Miller, who sort of, recreated Batman and Daredevil. I mean, those comics are really, really well written in kind of the Peckinpah tradition. People will turn off ultimately if it's just eye candy. It still needs to be a good story. Still needs to be a mythic story.
See, a strange thing has happened in comics today. Years ago, when we first started Marvel, the age of the readership was about, they'd start with 6 and go up to 12 or 14 or so. And over the years, as we tried to write more intelligent comics and get better vocabularies and concentrate on characterization and on plotting, the age of the readership rose. In fact, after a while, we had as many college readers as young readers. But now, strangely enough, there aren't as many young readers for these comics, which are thought of as children's literature, as there are older readers. If you go to the average comic book store and speak to one of the proprietors, he'll probably tell you most of his customers are over the age of 20. And these darker books that we have now seem to be very appealing to the older readers. I personally think we're going to have to start lightening the books a little, or doing books that are lighter, so we don't lose too many of our younger readers. But right now, this business of darker stories, such as the old Batman, The Dark Knight, which was one of the things that started it, and vampire stories, which we've had for years, and all the heaviness and more earthiness that seems to be in the comics now, while a lot of it represents a lot of good writing, I'm afraid it may be tending to drive away some younger readers, so we have to figure out what to do about that.
In comics, especially back in the early 90s, there has been this anti-code movement where a lot of creators have become very, very outspoken against the code and have really tried to force their books not to fit within the code, and have also tried to force other publishers not to publish within the code. However, especially with the newsstand, the code is very important to retailers because they feel that that's their mark of safety, and that's their way of saying, hey parents, you could buy their books there. But a lot of publishers have been against that, a lot of creators especially.
What we tried to do with Blade was come at all these issues, whether they be racism, whether they be class system, whether they be our fears of AIDS, and come at it from this kind of sneak it in, under the cover of this outrageous, comic book like movie. I mean, I'm a huge fan of the so-called neo-realistic comic books that are out there now, like 8 Ball and a lot of the things that Drawn and Quarterly are doing. I love those, and actually some of those would make for some great films.
Comic books are really an amazing form of entertainment because unlike a movie or animated show, in a movie you only have 2 hours to entirely capture the audience, or an hour and a half to totally capture the audience. In a comic book, if you don't get it just right, you have time. There's a monthly schedule. You can produce it the next issue or the next issue. You can always make the book better and better over time, or adapt it for things that are going on in the political arena or things that are going on in society and society issues. So it can adapt over time. So comic books have been, in the past, I think, a great representation of what happens in society. So as things have changed in society, comic books can adapt to that, whereas a movie will just take place in a snapshot of time, or an animated show will take place in a snapshot of time, whereas a comic book can evolve. So it can handle a lot more moral and larger issues.